South Africa waking up to violence concentrated on the major arterial routes, the N3, N2, M7 and other key roads in KwaZulu-Natal. Protests linked around the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma. Scores of trucks have been set alight, roads closed, shops looted in Mooi River. Incidents were also reported in Empangeni, Estcourt, Mtubatuba and KwaDukuza in the province. At least 27 people have been arrested. Damages running into millions of rands has been caused to infrastructure and property. Joining us now to discuss this is Dr. Protas Madlala, who is an anti-apartheid activist. We are also joined by Haas, who is a political violence researcher. We're also in conversation with Professor Seepe, political analyst. A very good evening to you all, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Let me start with you, Professor Seepe. The framing of what is happening in KwaZulu-Natal and South Africa at the moment, what is it? As we mentioned, that many people are saying what is happening is due to protests over the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma, whereas we've heard President Cyril Ramaphosa denoting the violence really to unruly criminal elements.
Well, I think, first of all, we must join the president and join all those who are condemning violence. But we must also bring to the table the very basis of that violence. Our people do not necessarily go into a violent mode unless there is a grievance. So we must look at the source of that grievance so that we can actually move forward. Where there's injustice, you need to address what is it that people consider to be unjust. Simply using brute force is not going to change anything. We can condemn, but we must also address the concerns that are raised. And of course, this has been ventilated a number of times, that it arises from how the court arrived at the decision to incarcerate the former president. And we must also accept that in that view, there are people who hold
Professor Seepe,
different views around whether that was almost suggestive of injustice or proper management of the case. So that is a very important to address.
All right. Let's hear from you, Dr. Madlala. Do you agree with that summation of what is going on, that it's rooted in injustice? We have heard the spokesperson for Jacob Zuma Foundation, Mzwanele Manyu, repeatedly echoing the words of the former president himself, saying anybody who is incarcerated without trial, this will be the result thereof. So I'd like to hear from you. Do you agree with this? And what about the resultant violence of this protest? Is it also an inherent part of the political polarization and contestation in this country?
Well, I view the events, which are fairly sad as they are, with a mixed feelings. I think there is an element of anger, yes, amongst the rank and file in KwaZulu-Natal. And by the way,
I do apologize for interrupting you. Please allow us to reconnect with you. There's an echo that's distorting the sound from you. Would you mind if we just reconnect with you again? And I'll come back and ask you this question. And apologies to our viewers. So while we sort that out, let me come to you, Mr. Haas. You have been studying for a very long time the political violence in KwaZulu-Natal. So talk to us about the political violence in KwaZulu-Natal and how it relates to the rest of the country, especially the recent violence that we're seeing now.
Look, it's quite well known, I think, that the political violence, if you want to, when you say political, the targeting of councillors or politicians, regardless, we don't know what the motive is because there are hardly any convictions, but that we call political violence, right? Now, when you look at that, it's become from the former confrontations of the 80s, 90s, etc. It's now become an intra-party thing. I mean, a few years ago it was intra. NFP, IFP, but in the last few years, certainly since around 10 years ago, it's been intra-ANC primarily, and that's the way the battles are fought within the ANC for a place on local government elections, or for exposing corruption. If you try to expose corruption, you become targeted. So it's kind of those are the political battles now, and this is just an extension of it, quite frankly. I mean, it's all to do with the factions in the ANC, and the one faction accusing the other of using the law irregularly, etc. But I mean, the fact of the matter is the Constitutional Court has ruled, and you don't deal with that through this type of action. You don't deal with it through going and burning or threatening. I mean, the behavior of the people at Encounter the weekend was beyond the pale. You don't fire off guns, you don't threaten to kill the police. The law must take its course because, I mean, the former president has exhausted his legal options that far, and he's got one more coming up. And I mean, a person of his stature is not going to suffer very much, especially if he's not well, for a short prison period. So it's not the way to deal with it. Violence is never the solution.
Okay.
And certainly this is instigated. This is not spontaneous anger.
All right. Dr. Madlala, I believe we do have you back. Thank you for your patience and allowing us to reconnect with you. So you were sharing with us your thoughts around what do you think is behind the current violence that we're seeing. And I mentioned what the Jacob Zuma Foundation spokesperson was saying about that at the heart of it. And Professor Seepe also mentioned that of justice or injustice, depending on the prism from which you look at it. Share with us your thoughts.
Well, certainly the issue is quite complex. I don't think there is only one reason why we see this uprising or the banning of trucks on our major routes. KwaZulu-Natal, it has become a weekly event. I mean, last week we had a similar event on the South Coast in Hipadine, which was linked to service delivery, and the N2 between Port Shepstone and Durban and Hipadine was closed down. And a few weeks ago, we had similar incidents somewhere in Empangeni at Richards Bay. So yes, then comes this issue. So one has to say it looks like incidents of this nature are becoming a norm in KwaZulu-Natal, and there is not one reason for it. Some of it, Mooi River, we know from the province that historically it has been used by our local truck drivers to get at the trucks, for those accusing them, the truck owners, of using foreigners. So I have somehow a feeling that yes, there is anger about the incarceration of the former president, but I think also there are some opportunistic elements trying to cash into this, hitting at their own enemies, such as the truck owners, using the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma.
Professor Seepe, I want to come to, I was listening to Mary Haas speaking about the myriad of issues that have led to violence in KwaZulu-Natal, and it's being said that, there's power struggles, patronage, and that they are at the center of the conflict in general. But I want to connect it to our political history from colonial times to the struggle against apartheid. Is there a conflation of some of that violent culture, or is it something that has grown exponentially?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge, as Protas does indicate, is that these protests are daily. They are not only confined to KwaZulu-Natal, and they have to do with economic hardship. And secondly, we have a history where our people had fought injustice. And the way they have fought injustice they have not gone mainly to the courts because they never believed that the courts will offer them justice. This was part of the history of apartheid. And there was a law and there was a rule of law, even though the system was unjust. And our people have a sense of what is considered to be justice and what the rule of law is. But where there is a sense of injustice, because they do not have the resources to fight as some of us will do, to get into editorial spaces, what they do is to go to the streets, because that is the only language that and the mechanism that is available for them. And this is why our constitution, recognizing that, has made it very clear that protest is one of the constitutional rights that people have. So where there's a sense of grievance, yes, you'll have people who are going to be opportunistic. And we can talk about the court may have ruled, but the court ruling, and the courts always rule, and you always have also a majority and a minority. And our people are not geared to go into the streets. But when you listen to a minority judgment, which is very clear, it says here you have somebody who's going to be who has been incarcerated without a trial, and that is ordinary people. It doesn't matter how much you spin it. They will say the person never had a fair trial. But also, even if you're convicted, people also have an opportunity to mitigate against that. And this is where the Constitutional Court, in its wisdom, has decided to say, let us give the people, the litigants, a chance. Let's hear them, because they are not going to ignore the minority judgment, which says there is a sense of injustice. And this is not to be seen only as if it is about the support of the former president or not support. It is the sense of justice that people have. And when they say there is something amiss here, we should not pretend, we should not belittle our people's sense of justice and fairness. Because when that happens, people do go to jail. We've had other leaders of the ANC like Tony Empangeni. There was never a protest because it was accepted that he went through a due process. So we need to address this sense of grievance, but we must also link it to the hardships, but also to understand that we have built a mechanism around our people that when the law is unjust, you make the situation ungovernable, and which is unfortunate. So the ANC must assume a major responsibility to indicate that there should be another way of dealing with this. But you don't wait until the horses have bolted, and then you think you can just erase like that. We have been quiet about all the protests that Dr. Madlala has been talking about. That happened almost weekly, week in, week out. And what you have now is something that seems to bring them together, but around what is perceived as grievance. Let's address that issue of grievance so that this does not become a rolling mass action. And the impact of it is that because you also have high unemployment, people are taking advantage because they've got nothing to lose. But the impact on the economy, especially in places like Richards Bay, one of the business people says, if this continues for another week, you are talking about a loss of over 20 billion rand.
We are going to have to take a break, but I do have to ask this question to both my panelists so that we have equal shared time. Dr. Madlala, I'd come to you to respond to this. On the one hand, it would seem that people are saying it's an individual that has brought to light, as what Professor Sipho is saying, the reason for protests. But then there are those who say, and he's also said this in what he said, echoing the sentiment that resistance to oppression would result in the kind of actions that we're seeing. But there are those who say, if you track that from the 20th century onwards, that this resistance has been non-violent. It's been more along the lines of demands for full incorporation into the modern state with civil and political rights of citizenship. So given that argument, what is your response then to how we situate what is happening and why it's only happening in certain areas?
Well, my view stands. open up the prison doors and let former president out, are these violence and protests going to stop? Are they going to stop? Yes, they are using it. They are saying they are angry because he's incarcerated. Let's just get him out tomorrow. Are they going to stop? Are they going to escalate?
Mr. Haas, what is your view of this? And I'm also borrowing from the literature that has been tracking political violence in the country. It has been said that a lot of that has been more in political or black townships, and that there has been very little in terms of interracial violence, or it's been limited. Is there a particular reason for this? Would you agree with this sentiment?
Look, it's much more complex than that. I mean, Protas is right about that. You're going to have protests. I mean, I think you need to understand that the reason we have so many protests is because we have virtually a dysfunctional government. We have 4 layers of government. We have council, we have district, we have provincial, we have national. How many of those representatives do constituency? They don't. Most of them don't. People out there in the townships don't get the services. They don't get any attention from the councillor, so they protest. That protest is the way powerless people deal with problems. It's become a norm, and it's jumped on the bandwagon by criminals. But not all protest is the same. I think, as Protas mentioned, you can protest for a specific reason. Now, the current wave, and it's going to happen because especially if they're local government elections, and please remember one thing, we have a history of violence. You have got so many people who have grown up with violence, especially in this province. And violence is the way what they use to, they're traumatized for life by violence. They use violence to solve their problems. Because of our history. Now, as I said, the only way that the government listens is when people protest, and that's why you protest. This process is a bit different. It was threatened. It was used as a sort of blackmail. You imprison the president and there'll be trouble. You really got to look at all that political rhetoric about it. But it's plugging into a whole lot of grievances. I'll give you one example. Outages in Maritzburg. But the irony of this is that this dysfunctional governance is largely a product of 10 years of misgovernments under the Zuma government. The municipalities have gone down. Mkhize had a manager who got a clean audit in 2016. He was suspended on a pretext because he wasn't taking political instructions. He was in the Ramaphosa camp. All the people he'd suspended came back. Look at Mkhize now. There's no services. It's under administration. So there's a reason to protest. So you're not having water, you're not having electricity. So you can now blame that on this government, on the Ramaphosa government. There's COVID, you're not getting your 350 grant anymore. So you'll blame it on the government. It's fuel for this faction, because this is not just Zuma. Don't forget, it's ACE. It's the whole lot. It's a faction of that. So it's all interwoven. That's what I'm trying to say to you.
Thank you so much for that point. We'll come back and interrogate it, continue to interrogate it, the nexus between some of these incidents of violence and, of course, what role the NEC and the PEC of KwaZulu-Natal can play in bringing about peace. As we heard in one of our other reports as well, the issue of who should be held accountable for the incitement of violence.